Hallo, willkommen nach Edinburgh, mein Freunden. Ich heiße Murray und mit mir mein sehr schönes Freund Jacob des Niederlande. Hello, welcome to Edinburgh. I am Al Murray and this is my good friend James Holland, historian James Holland. Is this your first Fringe, James?
Well, do you know what, Al? It isn't. I first came to the Fringe 30 years ago, in 1989, when my brother was putting on two plays when he was at Cambridge. And I was kind of third statue at the back in both performances.
He bullied you into coming to...
Yeah, but it was good fun. It was great.
Yeah.
I felt a bit older now, though.
Has it changed?
A little bit.
In the 30 years?
A little bit.
Yeah, I think I haven't been back every year since then, but almost.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Yeah. Well, not really. Not when you've got a liver like the one I've got. Right, now, for those of you who've stumbled in wondering what you're in for, this is We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Normally, we're a podcast about the Second World War, but today we've gone all multimedia with pictures and real people and costumes like it's 1997. So, James, as we all know, is a proper historian. You probably saw him on the telly during the D-Day commemorations. We did, didn't we? Yes? Yeah.
Hey.
I certainly did. Now, I'm more a passionate fan of the period. He's the trawlerman out on the high seas. I like a good bag of fish and chips. Anyway, here's the plan. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to play a sort of version of World War II Top Trumps. With all the moral complications that implies. Then for the last half hour, we're going to try and answer as many questions as we can. We've had some sent in via the Twitter scope and from you here this afternoon, because we'd love to know what you want to know. And believe me, James knows an awful lot about the Second World War. So we're in Edinburgh, of course, and we mentioned on the podcast that we were coming here, and we got a very interesting response from Andy Donaldson, who I believe is here today. Andy, are you here? Fantastic. Well, thank you, Andy. Thanks. This is an excellent question, and we were entirely delighted with us with this one. Tickets bought for Wednesday. I mean, how about that? Paying punter. I'm expecting a wee field trip to Princes Street Gardens. Of course, I'm from England, and a wee field trip is something probably quite different. It's when you caught short and pull off the M1 and find a gate post. Anyway, so a wee field trip to Princes Street Gardens to see Wojtek. Now, what is Wojtek?
Well, Wojtek is the bear that accompanied two Polish corps throughout the Italian campaign, and actually before that, I mean, they picked him up in Iraq, actually.
In Iraq?
Yeah, in Iraq. And
Poles in Iraq, James?
Yes. Well, see, so what happened was what a lot of people forget is that in 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland, a couple of weeks later, the Red Army also invaded Poland from the east. And lots of Poles were wrapped up by the Red Army, captured, put in prison, sent, put on trains, sent back to the Arctic Circle, where they spent the next year and a bit in a gulag. There were thousands of them. And then when the Germans invaded Soviet Union in June 1941, then they were very reluctantly released by the Russians.
And this is men rather than officers, because the officers, famously, the officer class in Poland was the Katyn massacre.
Exactly.
You have the Russians come in and quite consciously dismantle the Polish state completely.
Yep.
They basically do what they've done in Ukraine, where they completely pull apart the apparatus of the state. They remove who they see as the bourgeois.
Yep.
They completely dismantle the place. So Poland becomes this sort of work-in-progress Soviet province after the invasion in 1939.
Exactly. And so what then happens is they are told to muster in Kazakhstan, which is about 2,000 miles southwards from the Arctic Circle, and they have to make their way any which way they can. Along the route, a lot of them are going by trains and things, and lots of Soviets are trying to sort of encourage them to go and join cooperative farms and all the rest of it. Yeah. When they do finally get to Kazakhstan, there's a typhus epidemic and a malaria epidemic, and lots of them then subsequently die. But the British are financing them and equipping them to then take up arms beside them in the fight against Nazi Germany, and most of them are pretty up for it, frankly. Yeah. So what they then do is they then they go through Iran, Persia, into Iraq, and up to Kirkuk, which is where they are sort of fattened up a little bit, where they pick up Wojtek.
Yeah. It's on the risk board.
Wojtek.
It's on the risk board, Kirkuk, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and obviously, hit the news in the Iraq War a little bit,
Yep.
And subsequently with ISIS and all the rest of it. So,
Yep.
it's a bit of a war zone, it has to be said. But that's where the Poles are kind of sort of fattened up, and they start their training, and then they go on to Palestine, where they finish their training, and Wojtek goes with them, and he's become this kind of mascot. And they then get transferred to Italy in March 1944. And almost immediately are put straight into the line on Monte Cassino, which is one of the most kind of fought over bits of real estate in the entire Italian campaign, entire Second World War, frankly. Yeah. And they're involved in the actual capture of the Monte Cassino. I mean, they capture it in May 1944. And Wojtek is involved in carrying ammunition for them up to the front line. So they kind of put a strap on his back and he takes boxes of ammo because he's a very, very strong bear. And, and he stays with them the entire time. And they're fighting all the way through Italy. And at the very end of the war, when a lot of these Poles don't have a Poland to go back to, because most of them came from eastern Poland, which has now been absorbed by behind the Iron Curtain.
Yep.
A lot of them come to Britain. Wojtek comes with them and ends up in Edinburgh Zoo. And that's where he spends the rest of his days.
How amazing.
It is an amazing story.
Thank you, Andy, for bringing that up. Because
it's an amazing story.
I did not know about that, and it's quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
And you wonder what that bear must have been thinking, eh? Paddington, he's reading the Paddington books thinking, easy life.
But at least he gets bully beef, I suppose, rather than just marmalade.
Right, now we want to talk about great last stands.
Not the greatest last stands, but just great last stands. So there's others.
Yeah, so Arnhem.
Well, you talk about that one now.
Yeah, the admin box, or Bir Hakeim in Libya. Now, which are we most familiar with in this room? Arnhem? Arnhem. I think we all know about Arnhem, and it's Arnhem. I think Arnhem occupies. I'm fascinated by the position Arnhem occupies in people's imaginations as well, because it's essentially the last defeat that the British have in the Western theatre in the Second World War. Basically, it's the last proper defeat. It's the last thing things go completely wrong.
Yeah.
Last time things go completely wrong. And I
still think it was worth a punt.
Yeah, but so do I. But it's also the thing everyone knows about. So it's this peculiar. It casts this looming shadow over the rest of the campaign from September to May the next year, when the British Army and the Canadian Army get better and better at fighting the Germans, and then Germany reaches this tipping point and collapses, and we get to the Baltic. And yet people want to talk about Arnhem, and they're also
obsessed with the Driver 30 Corps, and actually in next month I think we're going over there, aren't we?
Yeah, we are.
They've got something like they've amassed 500 British vehicles to reenact the 30 Corps march, and it's all got to be done properly. And you've got to wear the right kit, and you've got to have the right vehicle and anything. Don't worry, we don't have to do that.
No, we don't have to.
We don't do that. But we're going to go over and talk to them. But I mean, it is amazing how the hold it has on.
It's got an incredible grip on people's imagination, and I think I think personally it's because it occupies this fantastic what if moment. What if First Airborne had, let's say, got a brigade to the bridge, held on in time for 30 Corps to turn up. Obviously, that would have meant that US 82nd Airborne should have taken Nijmegen Bridge on the first day, didn't for some reason. It's all a bit of a mystery, and certainly General Gavin, as soon as the campaign was over, made a great song and dance about how he'd been told not to, and all that sort of stuff, even though his men did.
And the boats were there after all the night before, and he just didn't know about it.
Yeah, and the men did get to the bridge on the day and then were ordered back, which is all quite murky and quite strange. And there's a very good book by a Dutch historian called D.G. Pullison, I think, who you'll find on Twitter, who's written a really good book, which is a sort of j'accuse about the Market Garden campaign, where he goes, it's all Gavin's fault. Everything you've ever read about First Airborne, the poor sods, they were stitched up because if Gavin had taken Nijmegen Bridge, they wouldn't have to have performed this heroic last stand because they'd have been relieved. And it's a fantastically angry book that I really recommend. Well worth the read, and he's really got a point to make.
Well, those polemics, those big angry polemics, sometimes they are really good, aren't they? Because they just make you think in a different way about something that you're very used to.
The admin box. Are we all familiar with the admin box? No. Right, so...
Okay, well, very, very briefly. Amin Box is really the first time that the British defeat the Japanese in the Far East. And what they realise is that Japanese are like locusts, so that they come in and they feed off. One of the reasons why they're able to kind of move so quickly through the jungle is because they're feeding off what they capture. So if you deny them ammunition, deny them arms, deny them food, then they're going to struggle. And that they're not the supermen that everyone kind of thinks they are. And the Amin Box is this administrative box for 7th Indian Division. So this is where all the stores are kept, and where the kind of sort of you know the cooks and the truck drivers and all the rest of it, plus some Gurkhas and other people, infantry,
so backstage,
and the West Yorkshiremen, I've got to say. But they're surrounded; they get completely surrounded, and they're cut off. But because we've earlier brought Spitfires over very sensibly, we've then secured airspace. We managed to secure airspace, air superiority over that northwest, now Rakhine state, what was the Arakan. This is where all the Rohingyas are at the moment. Everyone's talking about, and so what they're able to do is do these arms drops. So they drop all this stuff into the beleaguered guys defending the Amin Box, and they're told, whatever happens, don't budge an inch, don't give an inch. And basically they don't, they hold off, and these thousands of Japanese keep attacking them every single night, and every single night they just keep getting slaughtered, and the efficacy of these attacks by the Japanese just gets worse and worse and worse, because of course they're getting hungrier and hungrier, running out of ammo and all the rest of it, and doing more charges with swords and less with machine guns, and they win the day. And it's a terrible defeat for the Japanese, and completely throws them off, because just around the corner is going to be the campaign against Imphal, and the whole point was this was supposed to draw troops away from Imphal to defend Arakan, so that giving them a free passage or a much easier passage into Imphal, and that doesn't happen.
But the Japanese would literally attack from the same place at the same time every night, regular as clockwork, and the British troops or the Imperial troops would hear the Japanese shouting, "We're coming to get you now, Tommy. We're on our way," and so they'd shell and mortar them before they even left their rendezvous point. So the Japanese really displaying complete inflexibility.
Total inflexibility.
Having been characterised as being super flexible, super adapted to the jungle, really good at fighting. And in fact, when they were brought to a halt, they weren't very good at it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then Bir Hakeim, I like this one.
Bir Hakeim's a good story.
So do we know about Bir Hakeim? No.
Well, it's French.
No, we've never heard of it. Where's Bir Hakeim? No. So, James.
Well, Bir Hakeim is at the very end of the Ghazala line, which is this absolutely pointless defensive line that the British do, because they could have just defended Tobruk, which would be much more sensible, which has supply lines coming in and out of the port, has sort of lines of Torres Vedras equivalent already built in around it, lots of minefields, all the rest of it, ammo dumps and supplies, but they don't. Instead of properly defending Tobruk, they extend 15 miles further to the west and create a long line into the desert. And what Rommel does is he attacks at the very end of May 1942 and does what he's always done before, which is just outflank the whole thing.
It goes round it.
Yeah, except that at the very end of the line are the Free French under Pierre Koenig, about 12 miles further south from the last bit of the British positions, which in itself is diplomatically not very smart, I would argue. Yeah. Anyway, so the French are completely cut off, completely surrounded, and they hold out for absolutely ages. And of course, the Italians and the Germans can't just ignore them. They've got to deal with them. And they keep being repulsed, and eventually they do this overnight breakout. And it's absolutely fantastic. And because they're French, Pierre Koenig has a lover who he has with him at Bir Hakeim called Susan Travers, who happens to be English, and she writes this absolutely fantastic memoir of her lovely nights with Pierre and the general, her general, and escaping from the Bir Hakeim box. And you wouldn't want to go there now, but one could get there, and it's a sort of mound of sort of decaying Beaugest fort. I mean, that's basically what it looks like. What it looks like now. But it is the most amazing story. It really, really is. And the French really, they put a lot of fire in their belly on the back of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then fight at Alamein and so on.
Well, sometimes defeat is the thing you need, isn't it? To make you pull your socks up.
Yeah. Well, it certainly makes them pull their socks up. That's
right.
Sure.
Now, most decisive moment of the Second World War. Crikey. Now, I'm a bit surprised because the production team came up with these rather than us. I'm a bit surprised Stalingrad isn't on there, but, whatever. And producer works in football. So we have the Battle of Britain. Now, it's interesting, we've got the dates there until the 31st of October, because I think most people probably think it ends in September, don't they?
Yeah, but it does go on. I mean, it's an arbitrary date. The only reason we have those dates is because they were chosen by Air Chief Marshal Downing when he was doing his dispatch. And he does say at the top of his dispatch, actually, as far as I'm concerned, the Battle of Britain started the moment the war began, and it was over the moment that the invasion went away, which was not till the spring of 1941. But I've got to give a date, so I'm going to give this.
Yeah.
So it is a bit arbitrary, but it's really important now because it's a defeat for Germany. They don't get close to invading Britain. Britain has not come to the peace table, and that is just totally against the plan.
So all the things it was trying to achieve,
Yep.
it fails in.
Totally.
And in a way, what happens is the Germans walk into a British trap.
Yes.
It's that the defence of the British Isles from the sky has been designed to be dealt with the way that Fighter Command deal with it in 1940.
Yeah.
However, the story we have told ourselves since is, of course, we're pluckily
the last line of defence. Honestly, it was the first line of defence.
Yeah, it was actually
very much the first line of defence. Behind that you've got the Royal Navy. You've got 2.5 million men in uniform. Home Guard aren't all Captain Mannerings and Private Pike. I mean, some of them are actually quite useful, and a lot of weapons. You've got 18 bomber command squadrons ready with chemical weapons to drop on the invasion fleet. The whole invasion plan is a total shower anyway.
Yeah.
It would just never in a million years work. But it is a massive defeat for the Germans, and it's a defeat for the Luftwaffe. And suddenly it's like, oh, so what do we do now? Because they just haven't thought beyond Britain surrendering or suing for peace.
But they also hadn't, in honesty, the Germans hadn't expected to be where they were by July in 1940. They hadn't expected France to fall. They hadn't expected.
Well, I think they thought in May 1940 when they attacked that if we don't win in very quick order, we're never going to win.
Yeah.
So the only chance we have, and there's lots of senior German commanders who don't think there's a gnat's chance of that happening.
Yeah.
But Guderian does, and Halder does, who is the chief of staff of the army, does actually come around to the idea that actually it's a crazy plan, but you know what, it might just work. Hitler's all over it like a rash. Yeah, brilliant. Let's do it.
Do you think there was a meeting where he actually said that? Mein Führer ist ein crazy plan, but it might just work. You never know.
I'm going to roll the dice.
Yeah, because it was their only option. Their only option was to get it done quickly.
Yeah.
Because they knew if you don't knock France out, but it's also because they're all Clausewitz fans, and Clausewitz talks about the decisive battle where you strike a blow that knocks the enemy over and it's over, rather than the British way of looking at it, which is we're going to grind away at you and pay other people to fight you until in the end you give up.
Yeah.
Which is the way the British have done war
forever. But that's also the way the Germans have done the war forever. That is the German way of war, because they haven't got many resources, because they're stuck in the middle of Europe. What their only hope of ever winning is to strike with an enormous amount of force very quickly, the main point of impact, surround your enemy and annihilate them.
And of course it worked in 1870, 1871. They defeated France like that, knocked them over like a house of cards.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
And 1866 in Denmark and all the rest of it.
Right, so the Battle of Britain is
but it's because it forces Hitler to go into Soviet. So the only option is, okay, so we're running out of stuff, so what do we do now? Because hovering in the wings is America. Yeah. So what are we going to do? Well, I'll tell you what, we were going to go into the Soviet Union in 1943-44, but let's just bring that whole thing forward. Which obviously he does, and goes in June 1941 with catastrophic consequences for Germany. But had they not lost the Battle of Britain, they wouldn't. They would have waited till they built up enough strength and done it properly.
Yeah. Well, and now, the second one here, Roosevelt winning his third term, that's interesting because normally people would talk about Stalingrad, about a decisive battle, about maybe Citadel in Kursk, maybe D-Day. But what we've got with a simple piece of politics here, haven't we?
Yeah, and these two things are at the beginning of the war, because it's what makes the war go on for a long time, and it means that, and it goes back to Germany. If Germany's not going to win quickly, it's not going to win. And the key thing about Roosevelt standing for a third term is that there is literally no one else, no other political leader in America who could do what he could do. And he knows this, that he is the right man to lead the United States through this crisis, this process of rearming very rapidly and being ready to go into war when at such a point when it happens. And no one else would have done that. Without him taking that third term, which no one had ever done before, I'm pretty convinced that America wouldn't have been in the war in December 1941. I think it would have taken a very different turn. And certainly not again.
Even if the Japanese had struck at Pearl Harbor under, I don't know, who did you run against? Remind me.
Oh God, I knew.
Anyone?
No, it wasn't. I can't remember.
Anyway, but even Pearl Harbor wouldn't have been a sufficient tipping point.
Yeah, but I don't think he'd have then gone into Europe. I think they'd have just focused. I think they'd have made it just let's
Japan
go against
first,
the Japanese. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, after all, but he ran on a I'm not going to go into the war ticket completely, didn't he?
Yeah.
A barefaced lie.
And he also became president he was elected in 1932 on a completely isolationist ticket.
Yeah.
So it is literally the biggest political volte-face of all volte-faces, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a pretty big moment.
Well, it's a huge moment because, after all, it's your arsenal of democracy moment.
Yep.
And also, when the Russians come in, they're quite happy to provide the Russians with lorries and boots and tanks and and aircraft parts and all sorts of stuff and fuel and all the things that they need to win the war. Which brings us, there's no Eastern Front. Which brings us to Guadalcanal now. That is the decisive moment in the Pacific campaign, you would say.
Yeah, I think so. And I think just to go back to Battle of Britain and Roosevelt, I think that's what seals the fate of the Soviet Union. So I think, obviously the Eastern Front is a massive campaign, but in terms of decisive moments that really turn the war and make sure that ultimately the Allies win, those two are probably more important than the invasion of the Soviet Union, because the other follows.
Wow. Crikey. Well, I'm looking forward to our mailbox.
Winning Guadalcanal, that's what turns. I think that is the key turning point in the Pacific War. It's you could argue the Battle of Midway, it's the one where it all just goes really pear-shaped.
You've been there?
Yeah, I have.
Of course you have.
I have.
And what's it like?
It's absolutely amazing. It's stultifyingly hot and humid. I mean, you are absolutely drenched in a matter of minutes. But it is amazing because, of course, it's a very poor country. And a lot of the battlefield just hasn't been cleared up. And we did manage to find John Basilone's place where he won his Medal of Honor on Bloody Ridge, and you could still see the perimeter wire that the Marines put around in the jungle. You could find lots and lots of empty bullet cases and Japanese magazines from their machine guns and all sorts of stuff. I mean, it's really properly cool.
I was going to ask you what the cocktails were like. There we go.
They were terrible.
Now, we've got to trot through this because we're burning up our time, and what we really want is your questions rather than our answers. So, most important campaign of the Second World War, Battle of the Atlantic?
Well, it's got to be because, the whole Western effort is completely supplied through the Atlantic. If you haven't got everything from around the world is coming through the Atlantic and into those ports of, Liverpool and so on, and Glasgow, and you just can't avoid the Atlantic.
So that follows from Roosevelt in a way?
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And then the Eastern Front, because we a few podcasts ago, I don't know if you're all regular listeners, but we talked about D-Day, and we'd read something from the Russian embassy, hadn't we, the Russian Foreign Office, about how D-Day was a sideshow and not a decisive moment, and the Eastern Front was more important.
How dare us not mention the Great Patriotic War and all the rest of it.
And we upset an awful lot of people by saying, nah.
I'll tell you who's really upset everyone, though, Dr. Ben Wheatley.
Yeah.
He's a Cambridge academic, and he suggested that actually a lot of the losses to the Red Army tanks at Prokhorovka and the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 was because they just drove accidentally into their own anti-tank ditch.
They did.
Gone down. Well, they did. And he's proved it forensically. And as you can imagine, the Russians are absolutely incensed.
The Russian historiography, the Soviet historiography, was that it was the greatest tank battle of all time, with thousands of tanks on both sides destroyed, engaged and destroyed. And it's probably thousands of Russian tanks destroyed and 25 Germans picking them off as they all fell into the tank trap.
It's absolutely amazing. I've never come across a World War II story that is so entrenched, that is so completely, the myth is so totally different to the reality. It's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, even the Battle of Britain.
Roman Topol is one of the Germans who's written about this, and I've read his book really recently, his book about Kursk, and the point he makes at the end of the book is that there was a period where Russians were, after the Soviet Union fell, there was a period where Russian historians were able to get into the Red Army archive, look at it, tell the true story, and one of them was basically, and then of course the politics changes again, and you have to go nationalist again, and one of them was, basically had to leave the country. There's another German historian who's not allowed in Russia anymore, not allowed in the archive, has been completely blacklisted from Russia because he's been writing this way about it. And there's a book from the 90s that a Russian historian wrote, basically, the truth about Kursk, we were lied to, it's all nonsense. And that history, I mean, the thing that always strikes me is the profligacy that the Soviets had with their own soldiers, how many of their men they were prepared. And it's a period, the Russians win at Kursk, but they lose something like 8-1 casualty rate, which is just extraordinary. What kind of victory is that? And I always think that's the picture of the Eastern Front that we're going to get towards. Anyway, we have to move on because time is tight. Right.
I think we should just go straight to the audience, don't you?
Yeah, I think we're going. Yes, some questions from the audience, I think. Now we have Harry with a microphone. So
lights are up, that's great.
Here comes. It's Harry with a microphone. There? So right at the back, the lady at the back.
Thanks for all that. We thought we were coming to a comedy, but nevertheless.
We've had a couple of laughs along the way.
My question is not battle related as such, but I'm always very interested as to why Himmler didn't have a seat at the Wannsee conference.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, well, that is because that wasn't really his. I mean, he's the kind of CEO of the SS. And under him is Heydrich, who is in charge of the Reich Security Office, which is all the police and all the rest of it. And the subject matter of the Wannsee conference is not to agree the final solution, it is to explain to a bunch of other administrators what's going to happen and how they're going to do it.
So it's the
decision's already been made. So Himmler just doesn't need to be there. That's not on his watch. I mean, he's already agreed the process. So he's agreed with Heydrich what is going to happen. Heydrich's job is then to get all these regional administrators and say, okay, boys, this is what's going to happen. So he's just that's why he's not there. It's just,
He's delegated it. It's gone down the food chain.
Goering and Himmler. It's Goering on the 31st of July who actually signs off on it.
And who's next? The gentleman here. Thanks, Harry.
Actually, have you ever been to Wannsee? Because it is really weird. It is a perfectly nice villa. And it's like all these places. It's like going to the site of the Führer bunker. It's just so banal, and everyone talks about the banality of evil. But when you're there, it is chilling by just how ordinary and bland and unexceptional it is. It really, really is extraordinary. But in a really very lovely part of sort of Western Berlin. Yeah.
Hi, there's a section of Atlantic Wall built north of Stirling, and the county archaeologist told me it was to do with German concrete being better than British concrete. Is that true?
Well, not by the end of the war, but I mean, German concrete was getting really, really poor by the end. They were just sort of shoving anything. And actually, you can see this really, really clearly along the Normandy coastline, where you can see the bunkers that have been built with a bit of care and attention and in time, and you can tell the ones that have been hastily built in kind of sort of April and May 1944. It was the misfortune of the British at Sword Beach to come up against one of the best built and best designed and best constructed bunker complexes in front of just south of the beach and in their path towards Caen. But no, I don't think that is true. I think I don't know why there's some Atlantic Wall up in Scotland, but concrete's concrete, and I suppose they just sort of shipped it over for some reason. I don't know. I have no answer to why they would.
He doesn't know.
But
that's why he was talking about Sword Beach, because he knows about that.
I can tell you what. Early war German concrete was really, really good, and they loved it. They just couldn't get enough of building concrete. But later on, the war is rubbish. So it depends what stage of the war it was built. Well, bang in the middle. So I would say probably, on balance, not really.
Our volunteer from earlier on the end of the road there, the young lad here.
Do you think the bombing of Dresden was morally justifiable?
Morally justifiable? Well, that's an excellent question, because if you think whatever your answer is to Dresden, then it has to be the same answer to Hamburg. It has to be the same answer to Berlin, the bombing of Berlin,
Würzburg.
of Essen, of Würzburg, the destruction of the Ruhr, even, maybe the Dambuster raids, the raids on Peenemünde. It's an excellent question and one that comes up over and over again. But if it's Dresden, you've got to ask the question about the whole of the area bombing campaign, the whole of the idea of strategic bombing, the idea of whether it was effective or not, the idea of whether it's militarily justifiable and morally justifiable. Those two collide. Maybe you're because Dresden is basically the point at which the Allies they've no longer got air superiority, they have air supremacy, so they can do what they like, they can do whatever they like. They're starting to basically arguably run out of targets. The Ruhr has completely, by this point of the war, the Ruhr has completely collapsed. Its industry has totally collapsed. The Russians are holding Silesia, so they have the other bit of German industry as well. But what you have in Bomber Command is this incredibly effective weapon, and you can look at it like that. Before we get to the moral question, if you're the people making the Bomber Command decisions, raiding Dresden, doing a 3-day raid on Dresden with the Americans makes, in its own context, perfect sense, right? It's whether the moral question is then. This is basically impossible to answer, I think, because it also then goes on, this takes you to Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well, where basically the Allies have found a way of doing what they did to Dresden, but with one aircraft, which of course saves their own lives, saves their own technological effort, and all that sort of thing. So I can't answer your question.
The big thing about Dresden, though, is that it's sort of, we're going to win. Why do you have to destroy this medieval city? They weren't doing anything. They were just innocent Germans by this stage. What you have to remember is, first of all, Dresden is one of the most rabidly Nazi cities in Germany. Secondly, there's 127, 137 factories doing war work. It's a huge hub. And actually, it is at the Yalta Conference just a couple of weeks beforehand, because they bomb it on the night of the 13th, 14th February 1945. The Yalta Conference just a couple of weeks before. And Stalin specifically asks the Allies to bomb Dresden. The reason he does that is because it is a major marshalling yard and hub through which troops are being poured into the southern eastern front and also down southwards through the Alps into Italy. So in terms of a military target, Dresden is absolutely kosher. The problem is that the centre of the targeting is right in the centre of the city, not on the marshalling yards, and nor is it on the huge barracks just to the north of the city. And I think you can argue, and probably argue convincingly, that was questionable. The other thing about Dresden is that Goebbels immediately grabs onto this and says 120,000 people have been killed. And it is something that is still believed, of course, by, what's his name, that lunatic, David Irving, when he does his book. And actually, it's now been conclusively proved that it was about 19,500. I say only 19,500. It's still a huge number, but not even close to how many people were killed in Operation Gomorrah on Hamburg, for example. And everyone forgets that kind of Würzburg was totally destroyed, a few days later and so on. The interesting thing is that by that stage of the war, Bomber Command had the capacity to do precision bombing. The whole reason why the Americans were doing daylight bombing is because they did have lots of moral concerns about area bombing. America obviously didn't suffer the Blitz, had not been bombed itself, so the goalposts were different for America. They just were. They didn't have Coventry and the Blitz and so on. The second thing is, by that stage of the war, daylight bombing is not more precise than nighttime bombing. In fact, very often, nighttime bombing, because of superb British bombing techniques, is often better than daylight American bombing. And a classic example of this is 617 Squadron. In early April 1945, they attacked the Valentin U-boat assembly plant just outside Bremen. And this place is absolutely vast. It's 400 metres long, 100 metres wide. And the British have been watching this being built since the previous autumn. And it is to assemble Type 21 U-boats, which are potentially a big game changer in the war, had they come in a lot earlier. And they noticed that the roof is 15 metres thick in certain parts. I mean, 15 metres thick roof. I mean, that is just insane. But in other parts, it's only 5 metres thick. So they go over when it's almost complete with grand slams, which are these 10-ton, earthquake bombs. The bombs hit the 5-metre bit of the roof successfully, go down 3 metres, then the explosive charge kicks in, and that gets them through the last 2. And actually, if you go into the Valentin, remains of this Valentin assembly plant, you can still see the end of one of these grand slams on the ground. It is absolutely extraordinary. So they can do precision if they really, really want to. The point is, by 1945, it is just, will you bloody give up? We will keep bombing you. The moment you give in, we'll stop bombing. And you know what? The moment peace is signed, the moment the Germans surrender, the bombing stops. So, to a certain extent, blame the Nazi leadership rather than Bomber Command would be my suggestion.
So it's a tricky one, that.
Yeah.
Yes, the gentleman at the front.
Which one?
The second one.
Hello, I'm very impressed by the knowledge of the members of the audience. Now, mine might seem to be a question based on some ignorance, but what was the connection between the Germans and the Japanese, and why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, and how did it become the World War?
Goodness me, how long we got? About 3 minutes. Yikes. Okay.
Well, there wasn't a connection.
There wasn't really a connection.
They had several moments where they could have made the most of it, and could have done stuff to work together, and could have made things much, much more difficult for the Allies, but they never did, and never found a way effectively to do it. Neither government was particularly interested in it, and didn't have the mindset particularly for working cooperatively. So there are various points. I mean, obviously, it wrecks things for the British war effort is knocked completely over by the fall of Singapore, and that effectively completely changes how the British can conduct the war. But the Japanese haven't done that to help the Germans, and haven't done that in sync with the Germans at all. And so it ends up a world war because the Japanese pick their moment. There's a moment of world crisis where the British are looking in the other direction, and the British have advertised pretty clearly during the 1930s that they're not really going to spend money on defending their Eastern Empire. They're not really going to spend money on Singapore. They keep putting off Singapore. You see endless budgets in the 20s and 30s where they're going to spend the money on Singapore the year after next, and this keeps happening. So the Japanese are being opportunistic, really, rather than thinking we'll do this with the Germans. They think it's world crisis here. The British are looking in the other direction. They've got limited resources, and they've said so politically over and over again. We'll grab what we can, while there's a moment. And that's how it becomes a world war. Not really because the Japanese don't get on the phone to the Germans and go, anything we can do to help. I mean, it never really happens, which is kind of mystifying, because you'd think there is a moment. I mean, we've on a previous podcast we talked about Madagascar, about the Battle of Madagascar, when Madagascar is suddenly super important for about 3 months, and the Japanese do turn up at that in mini subs. Do turn up during the British and the South Africans essentially fighting the Vichy French. The Japanese do show up, and that's about it. That's about the only minute where the two ends of the World War properly sort of touch, but it's momentary, and that's it. I think that's as close as in the time we've got, as close as we can get to.
Yeah, I mean, just in 30 seconds. Well, let's call it a minute and a half. I mean, a lot Germans are going in and advising the Japanese in the 1930s quite a lot. So there is a sort of tenuous link there. But what is really interesting about the Axis agreement, which is signed on the 30th of September 1940, which is where Japanese signs up to Italy and Germany, is that all those three people, the understanding is we will all have our own sphere, we'll do our own thing. So the whole point about Mussolini is he's going to have his own little bit in the South Mediterranean and Africa, and he's going to be left alone to do his thing. The Germans will be left alone to do their thing, and the Japanese are left to do their thing. But so really, it's more of a kind of sort of, rather than a kind of sort of, I'm going to lend you stuff and give you arms and all the rest of it, it's kind of, let's just all agree that we're on the same side and we're just going to leave each other to get on with our own thing. The whole point about the Japanese is they've suddenly grown after the Meiji revolution in the 1860s, 80s. Suddenly they urbanized very, very quickly. And they're turning into a modern state. But Japanese is very resource poor as well, a bit like Germany. They just don't have enough of everything, and they've got to get it from somewhere else. And they're getting a lot of supplies from the United States, and are very resentful of the hold that the United States particularly, but also Britain and the Dutch, have in Southeast Asia, which they feel is kind of their turf and to be their area, their sphere of influence. So they go into China to take the stuff that they need to kind of progress in exactly the same way that they think that Britain has taken India and its empire and all the rest of it. And it doesn't really go according to plan, because the Chinese don't completely surrender, and actually it started to cost them rather than a gain. So then they think, well, what are we going to do? Well, we'll just take all this stuff that the Americans and the British have. And the only way they're going to do it is by knocking the US fleet out long enough for them to then have this capture, take the resources, build up enough strength, and then hopefully the Americans will kind of sue for a kind of peace in which the Japanese come out on top. That is the plan. But a bit like the Germans, it's a roll of the dice, and it's a massive gamble, and obviously it doesn't work, despite the victory. So don't be fooled by all the victories in 1941-42, because ultimately they just don't have enough of everything. They're not modern enough.
One more. We have time for one more question.
Let's go to the back a little bit.
Let's go. Yeah.
Chap with a tie.
Yeah.
Halfway up.
Halfway up.
Left-hand side.
Made an effort.
Right-hand side, depending on which way you're looking at it.
So he's skiving off work. It's one or the other.
Always. Love the podcast.
Thank you. Great. Well done. Excellent. Carry on with your question.
What is your favourite mark of Spitfire, and why?
Sweet. You go first.
All right. Well, I'm very partial to the Mark 14 with the Griffon engine, but I think it's got to be the Mark 9. Yeah. It's a pilot's. It's the most common kind of combat one. The Silver Spitfire's just headed off trying to circumnavigate the globe. That's a Mark 9, and and I've been lucky enough to fly in one, and it's got that 1,500 horsepower engine. It's just beautiful and fantastic, and just does what it says on the tin.
He's right. I think we've both flown in not at the same time, the same aircraft. But there's a moment when they start the engine, and you get this big belch of the unspent fuel when the engine starts. It comes belching over the plane, and you get this giddy rush of the smell of the aviation fuel in the cockpit. And then it makes that, the Merlin engine noise right there in front of you, or rather in you. And it is the most extraordinary thing.
Taking off as well, and you look out and there's the shadow of the elliptical wing, and it sort of separates as you take off. It's just, And Matt Jones, who was piloting, said, "Okay, James, you've got control." And I went, "What the? Have I?" So I was like, "Okay." And everyone says that the Spitfire's a real thoroughbred and a lady and all the rest of it. And I can tell you the lightness of the controls is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, literally, you're holding the control column, you just go like that, and it goes.
Yeah,
and it hurtles off.
That's why I asked him to take back control. To use a current phrase. Yeah. Right, well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. I hope you've enjoyed the show, and if any of you aren't regular listeners to the podcast, please do give us a try.
Yep, you can find us on all podcast platforms. Just look up We Have Ways of Making You Talk. We like to think that the episodes are timeless, and you can listen to them in any order. There's no chronology to it at all. Or rhyme and reason to a lot of it, to be perfectly honest. And please do ask us your questions, send in corrections. We don't know absolutely everything. Tell us stories of fathers, grandfathers, mothers, grandmothers, etc. And we do, I promise you, we read absolutely everything that comes in. So please do keep it coming. Anyway, enjoy the rest of the festival. Have a lovely time. Thank you very much for coming. And cheerio.
Auf Wiedersehen, arrivederci, and sayonara to you all. Thanks for coming, everybody. Thank you.